Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Edwards, you've testified today that the federal government shouldn't help state and local governments in part because, quote, debt-financed spending by the federal government pushes costs forward onto younger generations of Americans. You actually made the same argument in 2008 when you opposed federal aid for state and local governments in the midst of that recession. You wrote, spending on a stimulus package would be funded by additional government borrowing, and the burden of that borrowing would fall on young people and future taxpayers. You wrote that in a section you titled, Rising Federal Debt is Fiscal Child Abuse. Are those your words?
Yeah, that's right. I believe it is.
So that phrase, fiscal child abuse, in my view, is a pretty shocking thing to say, especially when you look at what states are being forced to do right now because they're not getting federal aid. Here are just some of the examples. Alabama and California are cutting funding for early childhood education programs. Wyoming is cutting $10 million from its public preschool program for kids with disabilities. Oregon is delaying a program to help children from low-income families with mental health issues. And Missouri, New Jersey, and Texas are slashing funds and laying off workers dedicated to protecting children from actual child abuse. All of these changes will have lasting effects on this generation of kids, especially the most vulnerable among them. So, Mr. Edwards, how much actual harm to kids today are you willing to tolerate based on your concern about so-called fiscal child abuse?
Those children will grow up, and federal, state, and local governments have been enormously irresponsible by getting the United States enormously into debt. The federal government has $20 trillion of bond debt now. Those costs are being pushed forward. So in the future, either those spending programs that you mentioned will have to be cut or taxes will have to be raised. An increasing share of the earnings of young Americans in the future will have to go, for example, to pay the foreign creditors, which reduces the U.S. living standards.
Okay, so I mean, look, Mr. Edwards, I'm sorry, my time is short, but I just want,
Sure.
It sounds to me like your answer is you're willing to accept quite a bit of harm to kids today based on the concern that, I don't know, I guess the debt will go up and maybe corporations in America will have to pay slightly more in taxes in the future. Look, it's incredibly cheap for the federal
programs you mentioned are state programs, so the state governments they should balance the costs and benefits of funding those programs.
Mr. Edwards, look, the point I'm making, excuse me, sir. Look, the point I'm making is that it's incredibly cheap for the federal government to borrow right now. The interest rates are under 1% for a 10-year repayment term. And I think it's frankly perverse to cite your concern for children to justify cuts that will do actual harm to children right now. And I think it's especially perverse coming from a lot of the same folks who happily supported adding $2 trillion in debt a couple years ago to hand tax cuts to big corporations and the rich. But look, even setting aside this moral question of whether we should make our kids suffer lasting harm today rather than borrow at record low interest rates, it's also just terrible economic policy. Experts across the political spectrum agree that every dollar of federal aid to state and local governments produces more than a dollar's worth of economic growth. Mr. Zandi has said that. Glenn Hubbard, who is the chair of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, has said that. And the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has said that. They've each found that a dollar of state and local aid produces about $1.20 or $1.30 in growth. But Mr. Edwards, you dispute that point in your testimony, citing a single study. You write, quote, a 2019 review of the academic literature by the University of California's Valerie Ramey suggests that a dollar of federal aid would actually result in less than a dollar of growth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it wasn't just a single study. She reviewed all the academic economic studies over the last decade, and she concluded that the multiplier for government spending was probably less than 1. There's no certainty here, but she thought probably. I would say also that this...
But sorry, thank you. And Mr. Edwards, thank you. That's all I wanted to know. But look, I actually took a careful look at the study, and it also says later that when monetary policy is very accommodative, in other words, when interest rates are low and will be low for a long time, government spending in the United States can generate $1.50 or more in returns for every dollar. So as I'm sure you know, Mr. Edwards, interest rates are currently at 0, and the Fed announced yesterday that it was planning to keep them that way through 2023. So do you agree that the study you cited actually suggests a return of far more than $1 on every dollar we dedicate to state and local aid right now?
No, I think that there was a lot of uncertainty with what she said about, she called a zero lower bound. Her main central conclusion was that the multiplier was from about 0.6 to 0.1. And if you look at her other studies on her webpage over the last decade, they similarly, they suggest perhaps lower multipliers than other people have found. I know Dr. Zandy
thank you, Mr. Edwards. Just because my time, I want to be respectful of the chair. Look, I agree that there was some uncertainty, and I wanted to be extra sure about all this. So yesterday I called up the author of the study, Professor Ramey, to ask her specifically what she thought. And she wrote me a short letter in response, which I'd like to submit for the record. And Ms. Ramey says, quote, "My estimate of the likely multiplier for federal grants or loans to state and local governments, conditional on the current economic and policy situation, is likely to be somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5. So I'm glad that we resolved that question. Look, I'm running short on time, but if this is the best case against more federal support to state and local governments, then I think that position is pretty laughable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Congressman Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. G, let me express all of our thanks for you for helping navigate